Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's webinar is Conservation Connect Photography for the Planet with Josh Deleenheer, founder of the Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective. Josh, it's so good to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Brooke. It's wonderful to speak with you again.
Yes, yes. I just love being able to bring rewildology people to the Daily Dose community and share your amazing work with everybody. So let's get to know you. How did you get started as a wildlife photographer, and what inspired you to focus on conservation-oriented photography?
Absolutely. So, to be honest, uh, my background, my interest is really in conservation, and it's conservation that led me into photography. I have been active in to various extents in conservation for many years. Um, and going back a few years ago, I had an opportunity to co-host an exhibition by the International League of Conservation Photographers. They put on something what's known as a rapid assessment visual expedition, where they send a number of photographers to a specific location for probably a week or two to document a conservation subject. So at the time, they were out on the west coast of British Columbia, and they captured a variety of different images and put together an exhibition. And an organization that I was involved with at the time hosted this exhibition, and I found it absolutely inspiring. So from there, I kept it in the back of my mind. I was involved in activism, conservation activism at the time, but I decided I want to shift my focus, and that the idea of using imagery to inspire and to engage people was really motivating. So in 2018, I got my first camera and started exploring that. And before long, my focus was always on conservation. So it was, at the same time that I was trying to learn skills, I was also trying to capture content relevant to conservation.
That's absolutely beautiful. So let's also set the scene here. So, a lot of your work and a lot of your photography has been focused on Vancouver Island. So, for those of us who have not either been there or might not quite know why this place is so special, could you elaborate on this? Like, why is Vancouver Island so special? And what are some of the wildlife and ecosystems found there?
Absolutely. So I've put together a couple slides here just to give some context of where Vancouver Island is in relation to North America. So if you look on the screen, you'll see that little blue dot, which is just on the southern end of Vancouver Island. You can see that it's the community of Souk, which is where I live. So if we zoom in a little bit further, we can have a look at British Columbia, and again, you can see where Vancouver Island falls in relation to British Columbia, and of course, it extends actually beyond that southern border and is quite close to Seattle. So Vancouver Island really is a unique place in all of Canada. It's the largest island on the west coast of North America. Um, you can zoom in here a little bit. The island itself is about 283 miles or 456 kilometers long, and about 62 miles or 100 kilometers wide at its widest point. It is home to some extraordinary old growth forest, some of the last forest left in British Columbia here. It's home to a wide variety of marine mammals. So, in and around the island, we have everything from humpback whales, the southern resident orcas that go between here and California. At the northern end of the island, we have northern resident orcas, we have transient orcas. And then if you go further offshore, you can actually find the offshore orcas. Um, we have Roosevelt elk, which extend from southern British Columbia all the way down, I believe, as far as northern California. Yeah, it really is a unique and extraordinary place. There are three different First Nations peoples on the island. There are the Kwakwaka'wakwa, the Nuchalnuth, and the Coast Salish peoples. The community of Souk that I reside in is home to the Sauk First Nation. Um, Gosh, yeah, I think that kind of covers off a bit of the geography and the you know the fauna and flora and fauna that exist here.
Yeah, it is high on my need to do list on in North America. Everything I've seen from the island is just so gorgeous. So I'm really excited to talk to you today, not only about what makes this island so special, but starting to shift gears into the top conservation issues. So since you love this island, you're very involved and you're just talking about advocacy and conservation photography. Could you elaborate? What are some of the top conservation issues that you know of or have seen happen on the island?
Absolutely. So we can start off with forestry. That's probably one of the most prominent and certainly visible when you start to drive around the island. You get a sense of what that looks like. So this image, for example, is one of the largest Douglas fir trees in North America. It has been referred to and known as Big Lonely Doug. But this was captured in the middle of a logging block. So one of the forestry rules in British Columbia is that if a tree is of a certain size, it's supposed to be left standing, but it really stands starkly against all of the trees around it that have been cut. This particular logging block actually borders on some other sections of old growth forest, which when you go from one to the next, it's extraordinary. As mentioned, I think the total volume of old growth forest in British Columbia stands at about 2% now of the total forest that remains. So that's, and even then, the government plays a bit with the numbers. Sometimes they'll use examples of forest that's in subalpine regions. They'll refer to it as old growth. It may in fact be, but in reality, it's not what's known as productive old growth. Whereas on the island, we're in a rainforest here. It's a highly productive area. The trees go quite quickly, and to go from a subalpine region to the coastline, it's incomparable. You really can't. There's no drawing a comparison to it. Other issues on the island in terms of conservation, we have what's known as the Vancouver Island marmots. They're a subspecies of marmot that only exist here. Their population has been heavily depleted, primarily due to habitat loss and fragmentation. So whereas they would migrate between different areas, they live in alpine areas. So their ability to migrate from one area to the next has been severely reduced, and as a consequence, their population is being depleted. There are other factors involved in that as well. We didn't used to have a resident population of golden eagles, but with some of the changes in climate change, we're now starting to see that, and golden eagles prey heavily on the marmots. So it definitely has an impact on them. Fortunately, though, there is an organization on the island that is working extensively to try and enable their recovery, and they've had quite a bit of success. Their population is still quite small, but nevertheless, it is recovering. So it's one of those conservation success stories. Similarly, the Roosevelt elk that I mentioned earlier, their population was severely depleted due to hunting on the West Coast. They're now starting to recover, even to the point that actually they have transplanted some of the Roosevelt elk from Vancouver Island to the mainland to try and help the populations there. But nevertheless, there is still poaching that goes on. It's well known on the island, and it does threaten their recovery. Other issues. This one, it's very prominent, and it's something that if you have the opportunity to witness, it's unmistakable, which is the herring fishery off the west coast of British Columbia. So many years ago, there were 5 viable herring fisheries. they were fished so heavily that four of those populations collapsed, and there is now only one single herring fishery that still exists, and that population is declining. So, as a conservation issue, herring is a keystone species, and they help feed other species such as salmon, which in turn help to feed the Chinook salmon in particular help feed the southern resident orcas, which are also a population in decline. But they also feed everything from sea lions to seals and seagulls, eagles. Just to witness that the herring spawn is really a remarkable event. Beyond that, there's also, and this is true of Vancouver Island, but it's also true of populations, wildlife populations around the world, which is coexisting with predators such as black bears, cougars, and wolves. I was mentioning earlier that Vancouver Island has the highest concentration of cougars in the planet. I want to say the number is about 2,500 or so. I'm not 100% sure of that, but nevertheless, those are some of the issues. Yeah, so just in terms of coexistence, the there's the ongoing issue of food conditioning with animals like black bears, where they become it becomes a norm. They're looking for food outside of their natural sources. They come into communities, and in some cases, they do actually hibernate on the island. And I was under a common myth when I moved here that hibernation was more related to temperature. It's actually related to food availability. So in the winter, the island, although it doesn't get as cold as the rest of North America, it does get cold enough, and the food sources disappear, so they will hibernate. But more and more, we're seeing black bears in communities where they're sticking around. Some actually aren't even hibernating at all. They're sticking around and finding those unnatural food sources. So that is certainly an issue. And then touching on other conservation issues, the sea otters on the west coast here in BC, they were completely extirpated and only reintroduced from an Alaskan population, I think, between 1969 and 1972. Their population is now growing. Fortunately, I think they're in around the 2 to 3,000 off the west coast of Vancouver Island, which is phenomenal. We also have the recovery of humpback whales. 25 years ago, they were virtually non-existent on the coast. With the ending of whaling out here, it has enabled those populations to recover and return, and we're now seeing thousands, which is phenomenal. And of course, they migrate as far up as Alaska as well.
Phenomenal. Yeah, thanks for giving us that, setting the scene for us and on exactly the kind of issues that someone like yourself, like a conservation photographer, might want to go out and tell these stories. Because if we don't know, like this might be the first time any of us have been hearing about these issues. And so, work like yours can really put a megaphone on these issues. So could you take us through one of these conservation issues that you've documented through your photography?
Absolutely. So I, a few years ago, became really interested in the old growth forests on the island. I shouldn't say that. I've been interested in the old growth for a long time, but I didn't live on Vancouver Island, so I didn't have an opportunity to get to a lot of these places. I've been here now for about 11 years. So yeah, one of the first subjects that I became really interested and engaged in, were the old growth forests. There's a section of forest about an hour from where I live. So if you follow the coastline about an hour west, it takes you to a small community called Port Renfrew. And in that community, or around that community, it's been heavily logged, but there are some sections that remain. I showed you the image of Big Lonely Dog. That's where that tree exists, and that particular place was a highlight of a massive protest in 2021. There were there were hundreds and hundreds of people. Actually, I think over the summer it ended up being thousands of people that converged in around that community that were protesting the planned logging of an area called the Fairy Creek Valley. That valley is quite unique in the area. I'll talk a little bit more about it here in a bit, but nevertheless, yeah, that area, it's been so heavily logged, but this one valley, stands, when you look at it, Google Earth, for example, it stands out very starkly against the surrounding areas that have already been logged. So yeah, that was one subject that I became heavily engaged in. The herring spawn, you can see the fishery here. I think I've been out there about 5 or 6 times to photograph that. Um, and the Roosevelt elk, I find them pretty compelling. They're a beautiful, megafauna species, and yeah, I've been drawn back to document them time and time again.
If we could go back to the Fairy Creek protest for a second, because I feel like something like this with that much emotional power, and I can only imagine what you witnessed. But I would like to talk about that a little further. Were you challenged or did it change you as a conservation photographer? Like what did you experience try to document what these people were trying to accomplish?
That it was very challenging in a lot of different ways. Um, yeah, the area. So I'll kind of walk back. It actually started in 2020. What happened was there were some folks that were out in that area, and they discovered that there was logging that was occurring in a location called the Granite Creek Valley, and the logging company that was active there was starting to move up and over a ridge. Actually, sorry, yeah, here is the Fairy Creek Valley on the screen here. You can see it. So this
Mm-hmm.
logging company was active just east of that valley, and they were starting to push up and over the ridge, and their intention was to log this area. So you can see how dark it is in relation to all the surrounding forest, and that's because we're looking at old growth forest. The lighter green patches here indicate areas that have already been logged, and of course the brown ones have been just recently logged. So protesters discovered that this logging company was about to move up and over into this untouched valley. And they started setting up camps. They wintered out there, just a handful of people in about, I think, 3 or 4 different locations. But word spread fairly quickly about their activities, and as they say, getting into spring and into summer, those numbers swelled considerably. That actually became what is considered one of the biggest acts of civil disobedience in Canadian history. There were, I think it was 1,188 people arrested over the course of that time, in, I think, primarily 2021. Uh, and yeah, so the whole thing exploded. So I started going out. I'd already been photographing in an area, so you can actually see where Big Lonely Doug is on the screen here. I started photographing in this dark patch here in an area called Eden Grove, which, so a lot of the images I've captured have been in this area. It's more accessible. So nevertheless, when the protests started to take off, this was an area that was already of interest to me, and I thought, well, this, it's accessible to me. It's close enough to home that I can make some trips out there and try to capture what's going on. So initially, I went out to actually just to photograph the old growth forest, to show how extraordinary it is. Um, and I was, there were certainly a number of protesters out there at the time. Things started off, fairly calmly. I interacted both with the protesters as well as the RCMP. The number of RCMP, the police force in Canada, started to grow considerably through the spring and into summer, to the point where they had a specialized team that was sent out, and they would helicopter into areas and try to eject protesters from different locations. Nevertheless, my interactions were generally quite good with the protesters and the police. Um, but it was challenging. In some cases, the protesters started to block off access to areas that I was trying to get to, and in other cases, the police were blocking it off. So then it became more challenging. It was difficult. The police sometimes would make it difficult for journalists. So I would present them if for example I went out on a given day to photograph some of the arrests that were occurring. I would present as a journalist, a photojournalist, and explain what my intentions were. Depending on who you dealt with, sometimes they were accommodating. Other times they made it extremely difficult. They would take you up into areas long after the arrest had occurred, or just not show up at all. So from that perspective, it became quite difficult. But as I say, it was certainly a rewarding experience. I learned a lot of lessons through that. I think the importance of staying focused, not getting distracted by the will and wishes of others. There were some of the protesters, for example, wanted me to. They were trying to direct me to document certain things, whereas I had specific purposes in mind. I think it's important to keep an open mind. You can a situation like that is very dynamic, and over time, you get a sense that what you were there to photograph on a given day may not be the most important subject to try and cover, but nevertheless, I do think it is important to try and stay on topic and stay focused. I think, yeah, in that sense, you've got to be aware and prepared to adapt to changing circumstances. So some of the images that I'm showing here, as I say, are the protesters and the police attempting to remove them. They did a lot of interesting things. They would barricade themselves into areas and lock themselves in with concrete and whatnot. So the police were having to chisel away and to remove them. In this case, this protester is up on a tripod, so if you tip the tripod over, you're obviously going to injure them. So they had to use a backhoe to try and extricate this person. But anyway, nevertheless, there were a lot of challenges to that whole situation. Sometimes you may not be welcomed. In some cases, I think I had a few situations where the protesters thought I was a police officer and were really resistant to speak with me. And I had to, actively demonstrate, no, I'm here as a journalist. I'm here trying to, document what's going on. It took, and part of the problem in that whole scenario was that the protesters oftentimes would change. So one week you'd be dealing with one group of people, and the next week it'd be an entirely different group. There was a bit of consistency with the protesters, not so much with the police. The police changed regularly. So,
Well, before I dive into more questions, I have to know how did this end? I'm all like, I gotta know the ending. Did this old growth forest get saved, or did they get logged?
so yeah, in terms of the protests, the police eventually ejected all of the protesters, and as I say, they were in a number of different camps. They were determined to remove the protesters, and there were a lot of laws, a lot of things at play, I guess here. The logging company had an injunction, so that's what the police were acting under, was to remove the protesters. It took a while. It took quite a few months before they were all removed, but they then restricted access to a lot of the areas. There's now the main camp where the protesters were staying. There's now a gate across that road. You can't even access it, and that's leading up into the Granite Creek Valley that I was mentioning there earlier. A lot of the protesters have since been through the court system. I would say in the majority of the cases where they were arrested, they were released. Usually, given instructions not to return. Some people were rearrested, but nevertheless, that went on for quite a while. And I think they've all gone through the court system, but I could be wrong about that. There may still be some that they're doing that. In terms of the actual logging, what ended up happening is the government of British Columbia enacted some deferral. So they, after a lot of public pressure, they recognized that there was a need to act on this. So what they deferred logging, which is not. it prolongs the issue, but it doesn't resolve it. It means that they could, when those deferrals expire, these companies could potentially go back and end up logging in those areas. In some cases, they've extended the deferrals, but this is an ongoing issue. And in the meantime, there are areas that weren't protected under those deferrals that continue to be logged. So yeah, the problem hasn't been resolved. The people, the protesters may no longer be in the forest, but the problem still exists.
And for context, I think this might be helpful because this is what I'm wondering. So, everybody, before we hopped on, Josh was telling me how much of this area is actually owned by private businesses. Could you elaborate a little bit further on that? And then was this area owned by a logging company versus like public land that is government owned and leased? Could you like first explain that and then tell us who owned this old growth forest?
Yeah, so interestingly, Canada is a bit of a mixed bag. Typically speaking, in a lot of Canada, the land is what's known as crown land. So it's owned by the government, and forestry companies get leases to go in and access the land and log on it. There are instances where people have private woodlots. They vary in size, but Vancouver Island's a bit unique in that I believe the majority of the forested land on the island is actually privately owned by these logging companies. So they do have the ability to restrict access. Um, there are other countries in the world, Scandinavian countries, where they have something called right to roam. We don't have that in Canada. It's something I think would be an interesting concept to explore. It comes with challenges. I do appreciate that. If you allow people to wander around on public land, there could be instances where they're starting wildfires. That's becoming a much bigger issue in Canada and elsewhere, obviously. And in some instances, you get people that go in and destroy logging equipment and private property and whatnot. So it's not a clear cut issue, but nevertheless, it does present challenges. I grew up in the central interior of British Columbia, where it was predominantly crown land, and you had the ability to drive out in the country and access these areas. Photograph wildlife, go fishing on lakes, whereas here, as I say, a lot of that land is restricted access.
I still think it's interesting that it's called Crown Land. That's just an observation.
Yeah, that's the historical ties. That's where you
Yeah.
start to get a sense of the Canada's history or yeah, ties to England.
So just out of curiosity, then, like to tie this story, not with the bow, but full circle. So
Mhm.
then, what happened then with like how did you then use your art? Like what you documented this story. Then how did you use that to get the spread the awareness of what was happening to this old growth forest and what the people were doing to try to protect it?
So I can say, at the time I'd only been photographing about 3 years. I still have a small social media following, but nevertheless, I tried to use social media as much as possible to reach out and make people aware, and worked alongside, other people that were doing the same. It is challenging, particularly when you're starting out in conservation photography, to get that message out. There was a woman who owns a publication in California that took interest in what was going on with this, and she reached out. I ended up actually taking her and a friend into the forest, giving her a tour of the area, showing where all this occurred, and she ended up using a couple of my images in her magazine. But nevertheless, you know, part of what I recognize as being a challenge of a conservation photography is that difficulty in reaching a wider audience. You're not necessarily going to get the attention of media organizations, magazine publications, those sorts of things. So this all really happened at the same time that I was in the midst of co-founding the Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective. Since then I've been able to use some of the images and content that I captured during that time have been shared through that organization and help to raise awareness of the broader issues of forestry and the value of old growth forests and those sorts of things.
So yeah, since now that you've been, you know, way more involved with all this stuff and like helping found the CCPC and everything like that, what elements do you feel are critical to telling an impactful conservation photo story?
Hmm. I think storytelling is really at the heart of it. I think there's different ways to approach it. Beautiful images, powerful images in particular, I think capture people's attention and help to motivate and inspire. But at the same time, I think it's really critical that you incorporate the storytelling into the overall. You've got to give context. Images are wonderful, but they can oftentimes leave you wondering. What is the story behind that? And I think it's really important um, to utilize research to understand the subjects that you're trying to document, to working with other organizations that have the knowledge and experience, whether it's environmental non-governmental organizations, whether it's First Nations. So utilizing their knowledge and collaborating with them to try and tell those stories. Um, yeah, I think those are kind of the essential elements.
Okay, and I think this next question is really helpful. So, someone like me, I'm an optimist, so I really hate doom and gloom, and I try my best to focus on positive stuff. But also, we have to be realistic about what this situation is. So, how do you balance, or how do you feel conservation photographers should balance showing environmental destruction while also inspiring hope? Do you feel there's a balance there that we could go off of, or what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think informing people is incredibly important. I think oftentimes the issues, conservation issues, happen away from communities in areas that are maybe inaccessible or infrequently accessed by people. So there are a lot of things that go on that people are simply unaware of, and that's where I think it's extremely important for people who have the passion, who have the skills to go out and capture that content to share with people. So that's the first part of it. But as you say, at the same time, if all you're sharing is sort of doom and gloom stories, you can very quickly leave your audience feeling hopeless, and that is, I would say, counterproductive. You really do need to incorporate the aspects into your work that help people to find solutions, to connect with solutions, and help them to get engaged. Ultimately, what you really want is for people to a care about an issue, but b to be wanting to want to take action. And I think it's important to note that no one is working alone in this. If it's a local issue within your community, you might find a group that is similarly concerned and wants to work on helping to protect and preserve. Whether if it's at a state level or federal level, then absolutely there are other people that are doing this, and I think by collaborating, and honestly, that's part of where I think the value of this collective that we've founded comes into play, is that it's that strength in numbers approach. By working with people, you have an opportunity to um, raise, I guess, reach a wider audience, to have a greater impact, um, and yeah, really become engaged in the issues.
And so then how do you decide what stories to tell or worth telling, or maybe somebody else should tell it? So if we're thinking, like, some of us are like, we really want to start telling conservation stories with our photography, what would you say some of the best ways that you have found to choose a topic and like dive in and tell the story?
So it really depends on your interest level and your capacity. Um, Generally speaking, I tend to believe it's best to start local. Look at the things that are going on in the area. What things speak to you. If you're passionate about a topic, you're far more likely to put a lot more into it. Um, but nevertheless, there are conservation issues happening everywhere. Everything, as I say, from a local level, right within your community, in or the areas, the region surrounding your community, and then you can just expand beyond that. If you're traveling widely, either in your own country or internationally, look at the issues everywhere you go, and see how try to get an understanding from the people that live there, that are impacted, the wildlife that lives there. I think research is critical to understanding the implications of any given conservation issue. Um, but yeah, figure out what your capacity is. If you're working a full-time job, you don't get to travel much, which is mostly my case. I do tend to focus primarily on local issues. Most of my imagery has been captured on Vancouver Island. But for others that have the ability and the interest, then take it wherever your passion leads you, I would say.
Ah, that's great advice. Yeah, it'll be such a better story to tell if you're like truly invested in it. I completely agree. So then let's switch gears a little bit here. So several of our guides, NatHab's guides, are actually members of the collective. So let's get some backstory here. Why did you feel inspired to found the Canadian Conservation Photographers Collective?
So yeah, I mean, this really sort of goes circles back to what we were talking about earlier. My passion for conservation. I've wanted to have a career in conservation for years, and my career path took some very different turns. Didn't go down that road, but regardless, I still felt that strong need to want to protect. I grew up, as I mentioned, in central interior British Columbia, in some incredibly wild, beautiful areas. We made a lot of trips to islands known as Haida Gwaii, which are on the northwest coast of British Columbia. Some of the most absolutely breathtaking areas in the world, I think. So I developed that love and appreciation for nature from a very young age. I'm very grateful that my parents instilled that in me. So yeah, carrying that forward through my experiences, in activism and whatnot, I saw a need, an opportunity, really. Activism is a hard world to be engaged in. I have absolute respect for everyone that does it, but it can feel a bit defeating sometimes, feel a bit overwhelming. I wanted to do something that I thought would be positive, where I would love my time in nature, which I do. So when I'm going out and I'm in a forest or I'm photographing bears or birds or whatever the case may be, I love that time, whether I get to see them or not. Uh, and fortunately, there are other people that feel the same way. So I would say, I started really down this road with a mission. When I got into photography, about 2 years after picking up a camera, I started to reach out to other people over Instagram to see who else might be interested in forming a national Canadian conservation photography group. There was some interest for sure. Didn't end up following up with it, but a year later, oh, I guess, sorry, that started in 2019. A year later in 2020, we did. It was right in the midst of the pandemic. I did the same thing, reached out over Instagram, and again got some solid responses. So that time we decided, all right, let's move forward with this. So there was a small group of us, I think about five initially, that were communicating back and forth, trying to bounce ideas off each other. I had a lot of conversations with one of the co-founders, Justin Taus. He and I talked. We would have first of all email conversations, and then later on phone conversations. Justin had a wealth of ideas. He'd obviously been thinking about this for a while, and we really started to put it all together. So over the course of about a year and a half, um, we decided we needed more people. So we reached out to others that we knew or others that we knew of, and then ended up with a group of about 19 photographers, and launched in October of 2021. It's things have changed a lot since then. We've grown now to 48 photographers. We have a team of 17 volunteers that work along with us to help expand and really accomplish our objectives, our goals for this organization. But that's kind of the genesis of it.
That's such a cool concept. I love it. I love bringing people together. So that's why I was so excited to bring you on. I got to meet you and everything. I'm trying to think of who all I know that is a NatHab guy that's on there. So Giulia Cimpini
Yep,
is, so Eddie Savage
yep,
writes.
yep.
Yep.
Anthony
Um,
Amsel.
Anthony
Uh,
Amsel.
I think we talked about Leanne Thompson as well.
Yep. Leanne's definitely one of our guides. Yep.
Yep.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, Leanne and Anthony are together, so that makes sense. They are an item, so that makes sense.
I didn't even know that.
Oh, that's just luckily for me, I get to talk a lot with a lot of these guys. So yes, yeah. But yeah, if anyone didn't know that, I don't know if I just shared a secret or not, but yeah, no, they live together.
No, that's great.
Yeah, yeah, no, and they are amazing photographers and amazing guides. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so just the connectedness is just awesome, like with all of this together. So that's why I was so happy to bring you on. So obviously, this is NatHab. We are a conservation travel company. So how can wildlife travelers use their images to create positive conservation impact?
Great question. Um, so again, kind of circling back to what we are talking about before, I think you really have to decide for yourself what it is that you want to do with your images, where your passion lies, what your interests are. Um, I think if you if you take if you're taking wildlife and landscape photos, if it's something that you enjoy doing for yourself, that's great. And I think that at a personal level, um, I think just being in nature, appreciating wildlife, appreciating nature, natural landscapes, um, it helps to inform us, and to, I think, want to protect an area. But if you start to expand on that and you think, well, I want to have a more active role, then absolutely, I think there's a number of different things you might want to do. I think you can accidentally document a conservation subject that captures your interest. That happens, sometimes when you're traveling, when you're going to new areas, or you go out on a given day to photograph a particular subject, and you just happen to discover there's something going on that captures your interest. In that instance, what I would suggest is take the time to research the subject and understand what are the implications, what are the causes, what are the impacts, and again, what can be done about this particular thing. And I would say in those cases, share the work, that your work with others, so they can gain that appreciation. That's again going at it at a bit of a personal level. Doing it through your, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or any of the platforms that you may choose to use. But if you want to take that further, and considering diving into conservation photography, then again, it really becomes a matter of looking at the areas of your interest, the areas that you're most likely to be photographing, and then looking at the subjects that are going on. We talked about the variety of different conservation subjects on Vancouver Island, some of which I was aware of before I moved here, but others that I've learned about since moving here, and from taking the time to learn about that. I think it helps to connect with others, whether it's other photographers or in some cases other local environmental non-governmental organizations that are engaged in those conservation subjects. You may want to work directly with them. You may want to contribute images to them. Um, you know, I have tremendous respect for these organizations. A lot of them are volunteering. They're doing incredible work to help preserve and maintain habitats and protect wildlife. So I think any opportunity you can to work alongside them is wonderful. But there are other organizations as well that researchers at universities, could be government departments or First Nations in your area.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. As somebody who stands in between both those lines, that I'm in the conservation world first and foremost, and I use that for tourism. And I can't even define or express how impactful these well-run trips can be for these local NGOs and for sharing these stories. Like, these photos on my wall, they were all part of a bigger project, but I was there, visiting as a tourist and able to share these stories. So yeah, if you have a trip coming up, what is that conservation story? Because NatHab, we are very connected. So, like, what is that conservation story that's going on where you're traveling to? So, I think that's a really good question to ask, as well as, reading our pre departure briefings and packing our list and all that kind of stuff. What is the potential story that we can share when we get back? So, yeah, well, Josh, this has been so much fun. And I'm sure that people watching right now would be interested in learning more about the CCPC and like maybe you and your work. So, where can somebody follow you, follow the collective?
Absolutely. So we're on a variety of different platforms. We're currently on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Pinterest. You can also find us on our website, which is www.theccpc.ca. A lot that has a wealth of information. Everything from our previous campaigns, we have extensive publication documents. If you want to look at some of the conservation issues that we have been investigated and campaigned on in the past, I highly encourage people to go and visit our website. Engage with us on social media. Reach out to us, even whether through social media or on our website. By all means, please feel free. We welcome contributions to our campaign. So one of the things we try to do is engage with our audience, get folks to actually contribute images. We've done that in previous campaigns. It's been quite successful. It's really interesting to see people getting interested, wanting to contribute, wanting to be part of, something. And I always appreciate their contributions. We are a nonprofit, federally incorporated nonprofit organization in Canada, so we always welcome donations. We're not a charity, so we're not unfortunately able to offer tax receipts, but donations would be most welcome. We run on a very thin budget, and yeah, we are hoping to expand our expand our services into so that we can achieve our objectives. So that's getting funding in place is one of those critical components. We do take on volunteers. Primarily, we do accept folks from within Canada. We have had people from outside of Canada in the past, though. And the last thing would be if you are based in Canada, and this is a hard, fast rule that we do maintain. We do accept new photography members once a year. The applications are submitted by the end of January. Many of our photographers are from other places in the world, but they're currently based here. So that's, as I say, that one little sticking point there. But nevertheless, for anyone who looks at this and thinks, I'd be really interested in doing this in my own country, community, wherever the case may be, if there's not something already in place, I highly encourage you to reach out. There is, as I mentioned earlier, the International League of Conservation Photographers. These are the top conservation photographers in the world. If you're at that caliber and you're passionate and you've got the experience, I would certainly encourage people to connect with them. But otherwise, yeah, feel free to reach out to us at any point.
Yeah, everybody's super nice. I would know. Yeah, just for context, everybody, I was able to host a roundtable with 4 members of the CCPC on the Rewildology podcast, and we talked about ethical wildlife photography. And it was very interesting since everybody had different backgrounds from, professional nature videographers to, I mean, just like all of your backgrounds was amazing. So I learned a lot from that conversation. Well, everybody, that is the end of my question list for Josh. So now it's your turn. So in your control panel, your GoToWebinar control panel, there is that little question box. So please go ahead and submit things. I will be the go-between right now. So if you have any questions for Josh, go ahead and pop them in there and I will gladly ask away. So we have one here that we have one viewer who went scuba diving to see harbor seals on the island in 2004. How are the seals doing now on the island?
They're doing well, unless they're around the transient orcas, which yeah, that's overall they're doing well. They're like as I mentioned earlier, I think their population um, plateaued in about the 90s. I can't remember what the total population is off the west coast of Canada and North America, but so years ago their population had been decimated due to hunting. And then I think around the late 60s, early 70s, they were protected in Canada. And fortunately, they've returned. So, and when I'm talking about seals, I'm primarily talking about Pacific Harbor seals. We do also have California sea lions as well as Stellar sea lions. And we do get some northern elephant seals in British Columbia. There are fur seals, but I have yet to see them. I think they're in some of the more remote islands. But yeah, overall, the pinniped population is doing quite well. Not as many northern elephant seals here. I'm not sure how their population is doing. We only probably get maybe a dozen or so in the area. They can be rascals. They come right up onto land. They go through a catastrophic molt in the spring or early summer. So yeah, occasionally they come up on the beaches and it causes a bit of mayhem. But
That's funny, a catastrophic mom. I bet they're just itchy and just like rubbing all over anything to get all that fur off and
yeah, those poor guys. Um, I mean, this you can literally see the like skin peeling off. It comes.
oh my gosh, skin too.
Yeah,
Oh.
it's not just the fur. You know, the outer a layer of skin comes off with it. That's what I think why they call it a catastrophic mold. They look to get onto land usually for about a month or so while they're going through that process, um, which is how they end up on local beaches. But they, you know, for seals and sea lions, it's more gradual. I think sea lions, I want to say, have maybe the easiest of them all. But poor elephant seals, they've got a rough time.
Wow, yeah, I'd say so. Okay, our next question here. Are you also on LinkedIn for anybody who loves that platform?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we have a social media team. LinkedIn is definitely one of the platforms. It's a little more challenging, I think, just in the sense that I want to say some of the you can't have multiple images, so sometimes we have to adapt our posts for LinkedIn. I'm pretty sure you can have video though, so yeah, it's we're there for sure. And again, feel free to reach out to us through that platform at any time.
Yeah, it's nice to see your photos on there. Yes, you're definitely there. I've tagged the CCPC, so I know you're on LinkedIn. Oh, okay, great. Okay, the next question here. Does the CCPC do any work in Churchill?
Not specifically yet. Several members, you know, as you mentioned, so many of the NatHab guides do work in Churchill as guides for that organization. So we are looking to some of the work that we're looking at doing in the future. I don't want to say too much at this point. Could potentially extend into that area, the Churchill area. Um, yeah, we don't have any specific projects. So typically speaking, the work that we've done has been we take a bit of a national approach. So our campaigns, you know, most of our attention has been focused on our campaigns over the last couple of years. The first campaign was focused on the impacts of transportation in Canada. So we looked at roads, rail, ocean, lakes and rivers, and aviation. So our first campaign, you know, we compiled all the images that we had relating to the subjects. We have a research team that investigates, you know, all the different impacts in those areas. So that, as I mentioned, that approach is taken at a national level, not one specific region. Our second campaign was about the biodiversity crisis in Canada, again taking a view at a national level. We haven't had any regional specific campaigns yet. Um, it is a possibility at some point. We have discussed it, but yeah, nothing at this point. I would say
Great. Do you have any First Nations photographers in the collective?
not currently, but that's something we are hoping to. We've made a concerted effort. You know, first of all, we want to try and get a degree of gender equality in there. So we have quite a few women. It's not a requirement, and it's not we don't exclude anyone based on anything really other than skills and their demonstrated history of conservation. But nevertheless, it's something that we're mindful of. There is some diversity, I would say, within our membership of different ethnic backgrounds, but unfortunately, no, not yet. It it's in the First Nations perspective is invaluable, and that's something over time that I'm hoping that we develop. Um, we have invited board members with First Nations ancestry, but yeah, no, currently I don't believe we have. Nevertheless, I do appreciate the value. I've grown up in many communities, having a strong relationship with First Nations, and have absolute respect for those communities and their
Yeah, yeah, it's got
perspective.
to get the word out.
Mhm.
Takes a while to grow anything, right? Got to start somewhere and then get the momentum and get membership, and we'll roll from there. Yes.
Absolutely.
Um, okay, I love this one. And I was thinking this exact same question. What is your favorite Canadian animal to photograph?
I have a. It's going to seem like a funny one, and I can't. I don't always have the ability and access to get there. I'm going to say there's two. I love bears. I go photographing the black bears every fall on Vancouver Island. We have a healthy population of black bears here, um, and in the fall when the salmon are coming up into the rivers, there's an exceptional opportunity to see them. It can be challenging. Sometimes you get into areas where there's a lot of people. I don't like those situations. In some cases, if I think that the bear, is being disturbed or whatnot, I'll leave. But I do love photographing black bears. It's which is interesting for me because I grew up terrified of them. I had
Hmm,
a
yeah.
healthy fear of bears, whereas I've actually spent quite a bit of time around them now. I still have an enormous respect for bears, and I will never encroach upon them or do anything in any way that would threaten them or myself. So I'm very mindful of that. The other subject I was going to say is actually pinnipeds. I love pinnipeds. So when I say pinnipeds, of course, I'm talking about sea lions, seals. We as mentioned, we do have a healthy population. I don't always have the ability to get out. I don't have a boat, so I sometimes have to rely on others or pay for tours or whatnot. I have been fortunate that I've been able to get out and photograph them. I've always loved pinnipeds. I grew up mostly in northwestern BC, where we would go camping and traveling. I would see more harbor seals, not so many sea lions. Here, there is a good population of sea lions, and they're just fun to watch. They're loud, they're a bit obnoxious, they're really smelly when they congregate in large numbers. But I absolutely love photographing them.
Yeah, it sounded like some fish poop everywhere. Yes, it definitely smells like.
With a good wind, you can smell them from a mile or two away. Oh boy, yeah.
Oh, I can't believe that. All
They
right,
actually
Josh, that
sing.
is the.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, 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 no. You go ahead with your story. Go ahead.
I'll make this quick. They congregate in an area called Cowichan Bay on the island in around November usually. Um, there are some long docks and they'll lie on the docks, but there are a number of boats that are either moored in that bay or tied up on the docks. In many occasions, the sea lions have actually gotten up onto some of the smaller sailboats and sunk them. Um, they're so massive, so when you get two or three, they'll tip it, and they've sunk several boats in the area. So yeah.
Oh no, that is a very bad day for that person. Oh no.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be the owner of those boats, that's for sure.
No. Oh, awesome, Josh. Well, we have reached the top of the hour somehow already. I could talk to you for the rest of the day. So I would love to turn it to you for any last closing comments.
I want to thank you for the opportunity. I've always enjoyed our conversations, and I appreciate the opportunity to reach a wider audience. I do hope anyone who's considering that is either already dabbling in conservation photography or has been doing it for a while and wants to become more engaged, please reach out. Always looking to connect, always hoping to broaden our network and yeah, meet new people.
Absolutely. Yes, everyone. And I will also include a link to the CCPC in the follow-up email. So everybody, if you didn't write it down, don't worry about it. You will get it in the replay email. But Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would like to thank everybody who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.